plant fertility. So we're going to be in here for a little bit, briefly, just to kind of talk about some things. Then I think we'll do a little bit about pruning in here, where we have some of the bigger tomato plants, so you guys can kind of really see what we're talking about with pruning. And then we'll go out into the field. I wanted to do a little bit of just kind of like a field walk to talk about a couple things that I'm seeing out there that we can just kind of go through with regards to like pests and some of the plantings and things like that. And then we'll do demos of trellising tomatoes and cucumbers. So we'll have a couple different trellising methods out there on display. Before we start, any like questions or comments from last week? Anything? Yeah.
Oh yeah, all of our college mates are gone.
Oh.
All about that fence thing.
Yes. Yes. So we did. Yeah, I saw 2 groundhogs out there today, a mama and a baby.
I saw 2 rabbits when I pulled up.
Yeah.
Oh man, they'll get you too.
Yeah, we do have the fence materials are ordered,
Right.
and so we'll be here soon.
So I would say that would serve as a dope opportunity probably for us. I mean, instead of getting risky about it, I think at the end of the day, the bed's already made. We still need weeks and another crop. It's just like turn that stuff over, use this compost over, and then start planting the other crops.
Yeah. I mean, depending on, I'm trying to remember, we can take a look out there to kind of see how the collards are looking. If they're like totally mowed down, then
If not, would you try to let them regrow? Is
I
that
have hope, but you have more experience, so I don't know what's salvageable. You know what I'm saying? But
your intuition might be right. We can take a look, and at that case, yeah, it might be the best option might just be to turn it over and plant something else. Hey Victor, how are you doing?
Okay. What are you talking about? What you just saw?
Nah, this
today?
stuff been going. Nah, this stuff.
Because I cleaned, me and Mama O cleaned it up. We went
No,
out.
I'm not talking about today.
Oh, okay. Yeah, we cleaned it up over this past weekend.
So, when we go out into the field, we can take a look at that and kind of talk through what the options would be and everything. Because, I think I did see a couple beds where it looked like the groundhog had really gone to town.
That's disrespectful.
Yeah.
Well, it was a bunch of stuff we talked about too. What I guess you're talking about putting up the.
Yeah.
But my other option, I thought it was crazy, but she had suggested, what about plowing a small area, basically feeding the cow?
Yeah.
It's a natural way of doing it without killing.
Yeah. And I mean, now that the groundhog knows where the collards are out there, it might be hard to make it
got it all
remember
mapped out there?
that area, but it could, I mean, I think having the fence up and then maybe having a dedicated groundhog garden or something might be a
Both
nice
together,
idea.
in other words.
Outside of the fence.
Outside of the fence.
Right,
Right.
A snack bar.
So, yeah.
Right.
Hey, how are you?
If I was still a meat eater, it'd be in trouble.
Well, I can testify that you taste this.
Is that groundhogs or collards?
Right? Especially after the tenderized.
So, let's see. Mama O, do you mind if I turn off the fans temporarily? Is that just inside here on the...
I think it would be good enough.
See if that's it. Okay, so Okay, so just to kind of get us oriented for the day, we have a few handouts here. The first one is, this week I just printed off for you guys my notes, because I figured it might be a little easier than doing like a slide. So this is just kind of an outline of what we're going to be talking about today. So it has some notes about pruning, about trellising, and then about fertility management. Then we have this crop maintenance chart, which I think I passed out already before a few weeks ago, but I made some edits to it, some adjustments, so this is kind of an updated version. These are all in the Google Drive. And then this one here is from the University of New Hampshire on pruning tomato plants. So it has info on pruning and kind of some of the terms and definitions. But then it also talks about a couple different kinds of trellising methods too. So we'll talk about those as well today. Mostly we're going to talk about this method that's sometimes called the basket weave or the Florida weave as a way to prune tomato plants. So this is kind of a representation of what it looks like here. The one with the bunches of plants kind of set up across a trellis. And we'll demo that on one of the beds. I think, yeah, Renee, I think it's on yours and Reggie's beds, right? Yeah. So we'll have that one. The other announcement I wanted to make, some of you may have picked this up. We have a health fair coming up as a part of the grant. We're doing a couple, what we're calling health fairs, which are really kind of like community fairs, like times for people to come out. We want to get as many people out as possible, and just kind of have a bunch of opportunities for health screenings and maybe some fun and some food and some community. So we're doing this one Sunday, June 27th in the afternoon. It's going to be here. We'll hopefully have a few different, a handful of different booths, including a couple of the Central State Extension, the 4-H program will be out here doing some kids activities. We'll have some cooking demos, and then we'll have some of the produce as well from the farm there too. So everyone is welcome, and everyone is welcome to bring their families as well and come hang out. 27. And I don't know that I passed out all of these with people's handouts, but here's a copy of the flyer. Yeah. And there's more flyers up here if you feel like you know a place where you could send a flyer.
Yes, I do. Thank you.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah, so that's coming up on the 27th in the afternoon. And if you want to be a part of it in some way, if you have something you want to add to the festivities with, just let me know, and we can include it as well in the program. Okay. So any questions or anything before we kind of get started? Okay. So today, again, we're talking about pruning, trellising, and fertility management, which are some of the three kind of main components of managing some of the summer crops that we talked about before. Specifically the fruiting crops. So crops like tomatoes, cucumbers, peppers, ones where you're harvesting the fruit. Sometimes they require a little bit of extra care in order to ensure kind of the best results. And two of those techniques are pruning and trellising. So who knows what we're talking about when we're talking about pruning? There are, yeah.
Basically taking off, trying to slow or training the process of growth by pruning some of the flowers off and trying to really ready for the flower
Yeah, you said a couple really important words there. So we're kind of training the plants to grow in a certain way. Hey, Lawrence. There you go. Yep. Hey, John, how are you?
Yeah, sorry about that.
No worries.
Good. Might sit over here.
Yeah, and you're welcome to take this if you want to take this further away. Yeah. Okay, so when we're talking about pruning, Gregory said an important word. We're kind of training the plant to grow in a certain way. And the other kind of important part of that was usually it involves removing a portion of the plant. So we're kind of trying to direct the growth of the plant in a certain way. And that can be for a few different reasons. So one reason to prune tomatoes or cucumbers in particular are two of the ones that are often pruned, are that pruning will kind of concentrate the plant's energy on slightly fewer fruit, so you often get bigger tomatoes when you prune, for example, or bigger cucumbers or something. So you can imagine if the plant has like a certain amount of energy in which to spend on producing fruit, if you if you allow it to kind of vine out in all different directions entirely, then it's going to produce smaller fruit. It's going to produce more fruit, but smaller fruit. If you maybe cut off some of the lower branches or prune off some of the suckers, then it's going to direct more of that energy into fewer fruits, and as a result, you'll have bigger tomatoes, for example, or bigger peppers. Yeah, Victor.
How does it work with cherry tomatoes?
Yeah, that's a really good question. So cherry tomatoes are often one that are not pruned because you're really not getting, it's not valuable to get bigger cherry tomatoes necessarily. Usually you want them to be about the same size, so you don't really see much of a difference. Yeah, so that's a good point. Some types of tomatoes, and in different cases, some kinds of.
In a way too.
What's that?
I prefer smaller plum tomatoes.
Yeah. Well, and plum tomatoes are an example. We'll talk about in a sec, but they're kind of an example of another kind of tomato, what's called the determinate tomato usually. So we'll kind of talk about determinate and indeterminate. One of the reasons you might still want to prune a plum tomato, say, or like a cherry tomato, would be to prune off some of the bottom leaves in order to increase airflow down around the base of the plant. Remember, we've kind of talked about this a few times. When you have more airflow around the base of the plant, then it's a good way to prevent the spread of some diseases. And to prevent some pest infestations, which can often come when there's kind of this nice, like humid, warm conditions that come with a lot of foliage, a lot of leaf. So pruning can kind of help in that way as well, not just to kind of direct the growth, but also to just reduce the amount of leaves that are down below, so that you have a little bit more airflow. Another reason, so kind of the last reason I want to talk about for why you might prune is that pruning can also, this is related to like increasing airflow, pruning can also help to kind of make the plant a little bit more manageable to harvest too. So if you have a plant that's a little bit kind of like a jungle out there, it can be a little hard sometimes to find the fruit and to manage it. Amy. Oh man, you are going to want to change your shoes, by the way, when you go outside. Just as a heads up.
Another one.
Okay.
Is it muddy?
It might be. Yeah, it's very funny.
I have clothes.
Okay. Yeah.
From here.
Yep, yeah. Okay. So when we're talking about crops to prune, there's kind of two that we're going to really focus on initially. And you can prune you know, there's kind of more advanced techniques to prune a lot of different plants. People prune peppers, for example. You can prune melons, depending on how you're growing them, things like that. But we're really going to focus today on talking mostly about pruning tomatoes, because that's one that is often pruned outside in the field conditions. A lot of times when we're talking about pruning otherwise, we're talking about pruning when they're grown inside in a greenhouse or in a high tunnel or somewhere where it's really important to have that airflow and where you have a limited amount of space, so you want them to kind of like train them to grow in a certain direction. So mostly today we're going to be talking about pruning tomatoes. Tomatoes are something that you would prune both when you're growing them. Often you prune them out in the field, but then also if you're growing them in a greenhouse or in a high tunnel. Cucumbers are an example of something that you would prune. We're growing them out in the field, but we're probably not going to really need to prune them out in the field. It's really more something that you would prune if you're growing them in a greenhouse. Okay, before we talk a little bit more about kind of when to prune and how to prune and some of those different fun parts, I wanted to talk a little bit about determinate versus indeterminate tomatoes. That might be, has anyone heard those terms before? Yeah.
Don't remember what it means, but I remember having heard.
So this is mentioned a little bit in the New Hampshire, the NH Extension Pruning Tomato Plants one. They talk a little bit about determinate versus indeterminate. So can anyone tell me what indeterminate or determinate means?
It doesn't really explain it on here.
Yeah, you should have had beefsteak under both of them.
They know what they want to do, and the others don't know.
It's kind of like that. Yeah.
It's more like determining ones have like a definite window and rate of growth that you can expect and measure, and like what you see about the plant versus like the determinate ones are like they just keep doing their own thing until you choose to pick them. Is that kind of how?
That's pretty close. Yeah. The determinates. The biggest difference between determinate and indeterminate is that determinates will have pretty much all of the tomatoes. Hey, hold on, cliffhanger. Yeah. Okay. Now that everyone's at the edge of their seats, so an indeterminate tomato is going to be one that's going to continue to grow and grow and grow and continue to produce fruit to harvest. So it's never going to stop pretty much until the frost kills it. Yeah, these tomatoes that are the miracle tomatoes that are second year fruit are an example of indeterminate. Pretty much all cherry tomatoes are indeterminate. Determinate tomatoes are going to produce fruit. They're going to produce tomatoes for a short window of time, and then they'll stop. So with determinate tomatoes, you'll have So with determinate tomatoes, a lot of times you'll grow them, you'll plant them in May or so, and then you'll harvest, that you're going to harvest them for, let's say, like 2 to 3 weeks, and then they'll be done. You won't be able to harvest any more of
That's
them.
determinate or indeterminate?
Determinate.
Determinate.
Determinate, yeah. So, trying to think of like how, like indeterminate means like they would have an undefined growth. I don't know. I don't know of an easy way to think about it. If anyone thinks of one, shout it out. But what's that?
Would you like unlimited?
Yeah, indeterminate is like unlimited tomatoes. Like as long as you keep the plant healthy, it'll continue to produce fruit.
It says it'll still produce it even through frost?
No,
No, up until.
up until frost, up until frost.
It says it continue to set.
New flowers and fruit throughout this time.
Where does it say that?
Bottom of the second paragraph. Indeterminate varieties keep growing indefinitely until frost.
Oh, until frost.
And continue to set new flowers and fruit throughout this time. That's a very contradicting statement. But
Yeah, I think it should have been a different way to
Yeah.
combine those. So they'll continue to set new flowers and fruit until the frost. If you were growing tomatoes in Costa Rica, they would be a perennial. An indeterminate tomato would just keep growing and growing and producing tomatoes, and it would never die because they don't have like freezing weather there.
Close to the equator.
Right? Yeah. Probably, I guess maybe not
More
in the
dry
mountains.
then, or?
Mostly it's the temperature. Yeah. So the fact that the temperature never gets below freezing allows a tomato to be grown pretty much like a perennial, right? Because it will never die. An indeterminate tomato. A determinate tomato will still be one where you grow it and then it has pretty much like a 3-week, again, like about a 3-week window where you're harvesting tomatoes off of it, and then it stops producing fruit. It's done. A lot of times determinate tomatoes are those, so we were talking about like plum tomatoes, something like that, those like the ones that you might make salsa out of, or sometimes they're called sauce tomatoes, Roma tomatoes, paste tomatoes. Those are all kind of synonyms for the same thing. The kind of oblong shaped tomato that doesn't have a lot of juice, that has a lot more flesh, so it's really good for making sauce or salsa. Those ones generally are determinates. Indeterminates, like I said, pretty much all cherry tomatoes are indeterminates. And a lot of the larger kind of beefsteak varieties are also determinates. Most of the heirlooms as well that you'll see. So the heirloom variety tomatoes also tend to be indeterminates.
Are those terms only used for like tomatoes? What about like green beans?
Yeah, they're pretty much it's only a term that's applied to tomatoes. So green beans have kind of their own way of saying that usually. So if you're dealing with a bush green bean, then that functions pretty much the same way as a determinate tomato. It has about a 3-week harvest window where it's really producing a lot, and then it will kind of stop producing after that. A pole bean would be like an indeterminate tomato, in that a pole bean will be one that'll keep producing until it frosts. So there's kind of the same distinction, but they just don't call it determinate and indeterminate there. Yeah. And I should say, like, if you grow a determinate tomato, you might be like, well, wait a minute, it's still producing fruit 2 months after it started. Because it will, like, still occasionally produce a tomato. It's just the production will go way down. Like, you'll see if you look at like the graph of how much you could pick over time, you'll still see like you might still get like a tomato here and there from a plant, but it's not going to be like 20 tomatoes at once that you could pick like you'll get during that kind of peak season. So usually it just doesn't make sense to keep them around if you're really trying to grow them for sale or something.
So should you know this before you plant them? Because you're not gonna trellis the determinate ones, right?
Yeah, so that's a really good point. So indeterminate and determinate tomatoes, depending on what type you're growing, you're going to manage them differently. So both in terms of the pruning and also in terms of the trellising. Let's start with indeterminate tomatoes. Indeterminate tomatoes, because they keep growing and you keep being able to harvest them for longer or for a really long season, generally you need a bit of a bigger trellis, so they'll grow taller, right? So you need kind of a bigger structure to be able to hold them up. And you also tend to prune them more aggressively. So you prune them more because they will produce more vegetation. A determinate tomato, in contrast, usually is one that requires a shorter trellis. You still want to trellis them, even if they are determinate tomatoes in some way, because it'll just save time in terms of the labor of harvesting them, and improve the fruit marketability, and reduce disease pressure. So you still want to trellis them, but you can get away with a shorter trellis. Like usually a determinate tomato will grow probably no more than like 3 to 4 feet. So it will like come up to here or so. Whereas an indeterminate will, I mean, if you grew them in a greenhouse, they'd grow probably about 12 feet tall if you gave them the chance. So a determinate tomato also, generally you are not pruning a determinate tomato. Because if you think about it, like it's only growing a certain amount of leaves, so the more you're kind of taking off of it, you're like diminishing the potential amount of fruit that you can get during those 3 weeks. Sometimes they will do a little bit of pruning along the bottom to increase airflow, but a lot of times that's not done. Okay, so I want to do kind of like a little bit of a demo to show what we're talking about when we're talking about pruning and define some of the different terms that you'll often hear with pruning tomatoes. Are there any other questions though before we keep moving about indeterminate versus determinate or tomatoes in general?
How do you know which one is which until you just grow it? You just have to look it up.
Yeah, so usually you'll see on a seed, within a seed catalog, they'll usually have them grouped in different sections. So in this case, I could RST, so after S. There we go. Always a tricky one for me. Okay. So they'll usually say, they'll have them grouped, at least the determinants they'll have grouped together. So here they have all of the beautiful tomato pictures, and then they have the section here that's determinate.
Okay.
Sometimes they're also called bush plants, because they're like more like a bush than a vining crop, but usually they'll be grouped together.
Okay.
Yeah. And if you're just buying a seed packet, normally it should say determinate versus indeterminate, or sometimes it'll say a bush variety.
Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yep. Okay. We're going to head over here to these tomatoes in the back, the big ones, and we'll talk a little bit about some of the different things that you should be thinking about when you're pruning. So we'll walk back over. This case means a portion of the tomato plant. Okay, here, try to.
Wouldn't this be on a, what did you call it, trellis or something?
Yeah.
It would
Don't
high?
be knocking my creative trellis.
Yeah.
It's
Okay,
called
so I must have been
using
right.
recycled materials.
I must have been almost right.
Yes.
Okay.
Those tomatoes were not planted. They
Okay.
sprouted when I took the greens out.
Wow. They
So
just
I
said, I'm here.
That's what they said. They were dripping over the
They
bed.
gentrified the other plants.
Well, no, I pulled the kale out. And that's what came up while I was waiting to see.
Awesome.
But yes, that's creative trellising. And I did pick suckers, so I know you.
I know, I saw that. I was looking for them. I was like, who took
That's
all
what
these
I was
suckers
doing,
off of
picking
here?
Go
Yeah.
find something.
I found one. Okay, so this is a tomato plant. So this here, we have kind of a couple different parts of the plant that we want to identify here. So this would be considered the main stem of the tomato plant. It's the main stem off of which all of these leaflets or compound leaves are growing here. Okay? And then the sucker of the plant is what grows at the intersection of the leaf and the main stem. So anytime you have that intersection, a sucker is what's coming off of it. And we have a couple examples of suckers here. So this right here would be the sucker.
Why? I'm so confused. Why is it the other?
Why isn't this a sucker?
No, that one. Next to it.
Like the
Right next to it.
This guy?
Yeah.
So this is the actual leaf, or leaflet. Yeah.
Is it because
So
they're
these are
smaller?
coming out at a right angle, generally, from the stem. They also have, whereas here, I'm gonna pull off this sucker. So the sucker it's pretty much a new growth point. So what it means is that like this sucker, if given time to grow, would form pretty much a new stem. Yep, exactly. So this is how that tomato can really kind of like, almost like exponentially grow over time. Because each of these new suckers, and like this little thing right here is a sucker. So this tiny little thing here, we can prune it off at this stage, and this is a sucker, and this is a sucker.
So it's condensing the energy again.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. So generally, when we're growing outside, we don't want to prune off all the suckers, or we don't want to prune as aggressively as we would inside. The reason we don't want to do that is in part because we probably have better airflow outside than we do inside in the greenhouse. There's more wind, right? So we don't need to like reduce the amount of leaves quite as much as we do inside. But also because, when we're growing outside, the trellising method that we're going to use doesn't require that we prune really intensively. Pruning a lot more aggressively because you only want one main stem. Or you may only want two main stems. And in that case, you need to remove all the sucker. Like you need to be on sucker removal duty like once a week.
Wow.
Yeah. Yeah. So when we're talking about pruning tomatoes outside, we're really only talking about doing it once and in the early summer. And we're just talking about removing the bottom sucker, just the bottom sucker once. That kind of helps to like get the plant to grow up a little bit and not branch out quite as much at the bottom. And it also kind of helps to remove some of that like bottom foliage so there's not quite as much green material like right around the ground.
This one
It is.
That one is versus this one.
Yes, so yep, this would be the sucker here, and this is the leaf. Yeah, and usually, like one of the other ways you can sometimes tell with the suckers, and that was an example of a bad pruning technique, and we'll talk about that in a sec. But one of the other ways that you can kind of tell with the suckers is that a lot of times they have this like really kind of fuzzy cluster of really baby leaves at the, kind of like at the beginning here. So you see how there's that, like, it's really kind of fuzzy and soft and young. You can pass that around. That's an example of a sucker. Versus this tomato leaf, which kind of looks like a leathery, like, dried thing. That's a bad, probably not what the botanist in me would say. But it is like, you know, it doesn't look quite as, like, kind of young and youthful as, like, a little, like, fuzzy, small tomato, almost like a tomato seedling. Yeah.
Have you ever been taught that whatever's growing in the 90-degree angle is sucker fish?
Yep. Yeah. Yep. Yeah, that's a good way to look at it. So like when we look at this, the plant, the leaf makes a 90-degree angle to the stem here. So whatever's growing, if there's something growing in that corner, then it's not a leaf, it's a sucker. So you're popping that off. So another thing kind of, I guess, to point out, just in terms of like kind of how tomatoes will grow. So anywhere that you see a flower cluster, that's where the fruit will eventually be, right? So this flower, if it is pollinated, will turn into a tomato eventually. And those fruit clusters are coming off of the main stem, okay? So if you let a sucker grow, eventually it'll get big enough where it will have its own fruit cluster come off of it. So that's why, you know, you could get a lot more fruit if you just left all the suckers on. But also one of the reasons why if you kind of prune them all off, the plant is focusing more on kind of fewer flower clusters, so it's producing bigger fruit. Okay, so I just said that what I did over here was bad pruning technique. So when we're talking about pruning, there's a couple kind of important things to be aware of. Today would be a bad day to prune outside. Why do I say that?
Wet.
Wet, yeah. Very good, yeah. So when we are removing suckers from the plant, we're wounding the plant, right? We're, we're creating an opportunity for diseases or pests to kind of get into the plant. So we want to do that on a day and at a time where it's like least likely that we could have some of those disease problems. And on a wet day that's humid and warm, that's when you're most likely to kind of transmit other diseases. So we generally want to do it on a day that's dry. It's nice to do it kind of a little bit later in the morning or after at least the dew is burned off so the plant isn't still wet with dew. And yeah, those are, and then obviously like not do it when it's raining. Yeah.
Did you say is or is?
Is what?
Isn't with dew or?
Right, is not with dew. Yeah, yeah, yeah. So we want the plant to be dry. Yeah. The reason that what I did here was bad pruning technique is, I don't know if you guys can see this, but when I pulled it off, I pretty much like stripped the plant a little bit here and pulled off and exposed more of the stem, which again is just kind of allowing for more opportunities for disease to get into the tomato. So you want to be really kind of clean when you're pruning. And you can do it all by hand, especially if you're doing it kind of when the suckers are relatively small. You know, you just kind of go in. It helps if you have a little bit of a nail sometimes, which I don't. But you can just kind of pop it off. And even when they're really small, generally they'll kind of just like pop off. If you're dealing, let's say you maybe like neglected your plant for a little while, not that I have experience with this or anything, but in those kinds of situations, generally you want to use some kind of pruner. So just a simple pruner like this, we could come in and cut it off like that. They make smaller pruners too, which sometimes can be nice. It can be a little bit hard to fit these in without also like stripping more of the stem, like I just did there as well. But something like this would be handy to have on hand if you're doing some pruning, because you might find some bigger suckers. Okay. Ideal size though to do this kind of pruning is when the suckers are small. So like 4 inches or so is how big you want the sucker to be. This would kind of be a little bit on the big side. This is probably closer to 6 inches. So like something like the sucker that I passed around to everyone. Yep. Yeah. That would be really kind of like the ideal size that you're looking for.
So when we cut those off, do we go put them in a compost bin or going back in the dirt?
Yeah, it's probably the best idea to put them in the compost bin, take them out of the bed. If you find like, you know, putting kind of dead plant material in the bed generally can just be an invitation in some ways for pests or disease problems too. Yeah, not to sound like a broken record, but the compost pile is usually a good idea there. Yep. Yeah.
Can't you root those?
You can try, yeah. So you can, you know, there's some different rooting methods. You know, you can put it in water. Sometimes you can add a little bit of like some kind of like rooting agent if you wanted to, but you could just put it straight into water and they'll root out. Actually, tomatoes would probably do that pretty readily. Yeah. So have you done that before? Yeah.
So don't throw those away.
Well, it depends on whether you need more tomatoes or not. At some point, I think there's like a cutoff. Okay.
Is there a point that it grows to a point you say, okay, it's too late to do it, just go ahead and work with it?
Yeah.
Because you can injure the plant.
Yeah.
Like a late stage.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. That's. If the sucker is at the point where, you know, you are having a hard time distinguishing whether it is a sucker or not, there's some here where like I can see like there are some initial suckers on these plants that are just like so big at this point. We would never cut off one because it would be like removing a 6-foot branch.
A limb.
Yeah, pretty much a limb. At that point, you're not removing like a hair from your head, you're removing like an arm from your body, would be the analogy maybe. So, yeah, so at that point, that would be when you would kind of just let it go. And that's particularly, you have a lot more like leeway to do that out in the field, because really all that you're doing when you're pruning out in the field is giving the plant a little bit of a haircut so that it, you know, kind of you're directing the growth up a little bit more. In the greenhouse, if we were doing this using an overhead trellising system, we would have to be, you know, again, we'd have to be pruning at least weekly. And we'd have to be, like, we would probably remove larger suckers at that point too. Because it can become kind of quickly a bit of a jungle if you don't kind of keep it clean in here. Yeah.
Something similar to this?
Yeah, so this is an example. They didn't quite do, I don't think Mama O did like a single liter system, but a lot of times what you see here, you know, when you have like the overhead twine like this, you'll prune the tomato plant so it has just one stem, so you'll remove all suckers from it, and then you'll kind of clip it to this main line as it grows. So it'll kind of like almost just grow up straight like a tree. And then you'll have all of the fruit kind of coming off of
Kind
it.
of prop it up a little bit.
Yeah,
As it
yep.
goes up.
Yeah, the clips actually are really nice. Usually I like to have a clip somewhere, but it's kind of like a little ring. So it'll cinch on to this and then like hold the stem in place. The other option is you can kind of wrap the stem around this as it grows.
Like a vine.
Almost like a vine, yeah, to kind of train it up. The disadvantage of that is that you're kind of creating more potential wounds in the stem, because like as it rubs against this a little bit with the wind, it'll tear the stem.
So not good for outside.
You want a wind problem in here.
A little bit. You'll have a little bit of air movement that'll cause this to move a bit, yeah. And you want that. You want some kind of cross ventilation too, because tomatoes are wind pollinated. So they don't require a pollinator, and so you need a little bit of air movement in order to pollinate them successfully. But yeah, this would be kind of like an example. In other, like if you had so if this was a high tunnel, not a greenhouse, and we were growing like in ground, say, or even if we weren't, what we could do is like string, you know, we might like put a bar like this here across like all of the top trusses, and then we would drop the trellis lines from them, and you know, drop them every place that we have a plant, and then just train each plant up that line. So
Say you slowly ease the rope, the line up as it grows.
no, the line would be in place from the beginning, because you want it, like this line is taut now because it has the weight of the plant that's kind of keeping it in place. So you want the line in place from the beginning, from the top. But you would just kind of like clip the tomato plant to it as it grows, up and up and up, like that. Yeah, yeah. It looks really cool. If you guys want to like look into this a little bit more, you check out like Hoop House Tomatoes. You can see some pretty cool systems for trellising tomatoes. It looks really like beautiful and like a jungle kind of. So it's cool. One note, if you are using pruners to do your pruning and you notice any disease, like you notice that you have any disease problems with your tomatoes, it's generally a good idea to sanitize the pruners in between plants. So just have some kind of sanitizer with their spray, you know, even like an alcohol sanitizer or something like that, to dip them in or to spray them off between plants. Because this can be a really easy way to spread diseases between plants. If you're using your hands, you have like some kind of natural oils, which are a little bit more of a defense against that. But if you're doing like a lot of space, it might be a good idea to wash your hands in between at least rows then. Okay, good. Okay. I think then we're ready to go outside. Let's see. Yeah, we talked about suckering. Talked about timing. Yeah. Cool. We're going to talk a little bit about trellising. So when we're talking about trellising, basically we're just talking about any kind of support for the crop to like grow it vertically. So we're keeping it off the ground, growing it up off the ground. And there's many different ways to do this. So on like if you just have a couple tomato plants at home, you might just have like one of those tomato cages that you pop around the plant, and then that kind of keeps it supported so that it'll keep growing up. When we're talking about growing a bunch of tomatoes, like like a whole row or something like that, you usually need a kind of a slightly different trellising method to make it a little bit more efficient to install, so that we don't have to install like a cage for every tomato plant that we have. So this is one example of how to do that. This is sometimes called like a basket weave or a Florida weave. There's different kind of approaches, but so this is our tomato bed. These here are just I think really they're a U-post, but a T-post or a metal post of some sort. Something that's relatively sturdy. Again, all of the tomatoes that we have here are that we're growing. Pretty sure all of them are Indeterminate tomatoes, so they're going to get relatively big. So we want a pretty sturdy stake to be able to hold the weight of them. A lot of times growers will do this with like wooden posts, and then about halfway through the season, if they have a lot of plants, they might have the post kind of falling over or something. So I would usually recommend doing at least metal posts on the end. Oh my gosh, the cicadas are very loud.
They don't bite.
There's two right behind.
No, they flew right behind.
Oh, okay.
Okay.
Just give me a heads up. I got one lands on my head. Okay. Like a calm heads up. Yeah. Yeah, I had one on my shoulder earlier. Yeah. Okay. So this kind of system, basically what we're doing with the post, we're putting a post about every 10 feet. So in a 50-foot bed, we'll have 6 posts total.
Just metal on both ends and wood in the middle.
Yeah, you could either do metal all the way through, or at least metal on the ends and then wooden in the middle.
Does the metal affect the ground?
No, these are all galvanized and are, wouldn't be something that you would have to be concerned about there. Yeah, it's not like a treated wood or something like that. So we install the post, and then we use trellis twine to cinch the tomato plants in between our lines. So, not that one yet. Not that one yet. Okay. So, we have a couple boxes of these in here. This is the trellis twine that we're using, just, like a thin trellis twine. The reason that there's a strip tape attached to it is that it's super fashionable to take a piece of irrigation tape and make a belt out of this. And I'm only half joking here because it is kind of nice. They actually make loopholes in this box so that you can kind of keep it at waist height, so you don't have to constantly be like bending down or like trying to figure out where it is. So it just stays on your hip here. And so when you're actually doing the trellising, I did this line already. You're just tying it off at one end and then going down one side, wrapping it around the post. And then if we had posts kind of installed every 10 feet here, we could do kind of the whole line down one side and then come back the other way and sandwich the plants in between. So pretty much all we're doing is trying to we're finding that main stem and we're sandwiching all the plants in between it. They look a little like hilarious right now because one, they have a number of suckers, and two, like this is kind of the first time that we're trellising them. So up until this point, they've kind of been growing horizontally. So this is really like kind of the perfect time to do trellising, especially with pretty much all of them that are like up to here. I would probably just trellis this whole bed, but this is really a good time to do it, because if the plants get much bigger than this, then they'll start to fall over, and it'll be really hard to like kind of cinch them up.
Did you go up another level for this one, these right here?
Yes, yeah. So the way that this will work is you kind of do this incrementally as the plants grow. So when they reach, again, about this height where they're about a foot off the ground, you do your first level. And then as they grow a little bit higher, probably as they could reach up to about here, then you'll do your next level. So you'll just do the same process, kind of going down one side and then going back down the other side. Let's see. We can talk a little bit about suckers with these guys, because we mentioned out in the field that the process would be to just remove kind of one sucker at the bottom, the first sucker. So in this case here, we have this tomato plant, which has gotten a little bit kind of wiggly, but this is the main stem here. And so if we go kind of all the way down on the plant, this is going to be the first sucker. So just the one kind of down at the bottom. Again, you can usually kind of tell even once you start to kind of look a little bit more at the leaves, you'll notice that the leaves, they don't have any growth point at the end. Whereas the sucker has a bunch of small leaves and kind of like a fuzzy end that's the growth point. So that's how you know it's a sucker. So you're just removing the bottom one. In this case, there's kind of a few suckers down there, so I might take off one more just because there's a lot going on. But that's pretty much it for these, is that I would do this pruning really just when I'm doing my first trellising. I'd remove the first couple suckers, and then that's all the pruning that you have to do on these at this point. It'll kind of help it from getting a little bit too quick. So that's the basket weave or Florida weave method. So you're just adding layers as the plant gets bigger. And there's that pretty good diagram in the extension, the UNH extension handout that I gave, that has kind of an example of the plants being like strung up to I think like 3 or 4 feet. So look it up all the way. We can, yeah. So we have 1 T-post pounder. So these will go in about every 10 feet, which is about every 5 plants. I will say we got these U-posts, which we probably won't get them again because they are just barely fit the T-post pounder. So you do have to kind of watch out for these notches here, because you can pound off the notches, which I did twice earlier. So, but yeah, we can keep going. We can install all the posts for this row.
That would be used to knock it in.
And actually, Victor, before you do that, do you want to install the post for this cucumber row? Because I wanted to talk about the cucumber as well. And this is, Deontay and Victor, these are your cucumbers, right?
Actually, those are, I'm not sure what those are. I didn't know that those are tomatoes.
Okay. I'm pretty sure these are your cucumbers because we planted these, Victor, during one of the classes, right? Yeah.
Yeah, these are groundhog cucumbers that we didn't want to use.
Well, we have this row cover over it. So. Okay, so while Victor is punching in the post here,
they're going to be too loud while you're talking.
no, go ahead.
Seriously, I don't know.
That's good. Yeah.
You did it!
Good.
I work in the traffic signal sign shop sometimes. So that's, in fact, I could bring a bigger pounder for these.
Hey, that might be, if you have a bigger one.
I might be able to.
That might be nice, because that's actually
I
I have to bring my personal one in, because
the one we got did it. So the cucumber plants are growing pretty nicely here. Looking good.
Will it be about 10 feet too?
Yeah, you can put it kind of even with another. In between these two layers of twine in order to grow up straight. The cucumbers have, let's see if they probably are too young to have these at this point. Cucumbers have these little tendrils that they'll use to climb up. So just like, here, we have some peas over here.
You're optimistic about that stuff.
I saw the peas earlier. So the peas have these little tendrils here.
Oh, okay.
These are called tendrils. This is what the pea will use that to climb up something. So just these little kind of curlicues at the end. So the peas will use that to climb up. They'll climb to each other, climb up a plant, climb up a trellis, climb up whatever. And cucumbers have the same thing. So all we need to provide them is like a wall to grow up. And the way that we can do that here is by using this netting. So this you could also kind of like make that so you could also kind of make this with the twine. You just have to like do a little bit more work, to make all of these layers. Yeah. So you kind of open it up like this. I think this is a 6-foot one, so it's going to be a little bit higher.
Badness.
Yeah, you take the T-post off. So when you're installing the T-post, and it's a good thing we did this without even talking about it, we install the T-post all facing the same way so that we can hook this on to the hook. You need a little bit more. Yeah, so you can just hook this on every so often. And then we have inside, which I'll go, actually. Hey John, would you mind grabbing zip ties? They're on the supply shelf. So we'll just use zip ties to zip tie it to the edge here.
I know the bottom has this reverse. So you see what I mean?
Yeah,
so
yeah.
These two are reversed so you can hook
Yeah. Yeah, it is a little.
That's what I was thinking.
I know. It's a little. They're kind of at the bottom. They are. In this case, what I would suggest, because we have a little bit of extra length, let's probably put that at the top instead of at the bottom. So we're giving kind of the plants at the bottom a little bit of a cleaner.
Don't confuse it. Get mine go first.
Yeah. Did I give you enough there?
Yeah.
Okay.
Is that what you mean?
Yeah, and then we'll kind of bring it down to the bottom so that it's at a level where the cucumbers can.
How will you keep it down in the middle?
We can always, just put a stake down. Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. So we can just use one of the garden stakes, the round staple, and bring it down. And at this point, now that we're putting the trellis up, obviously, we're going to take the row cover off. Take from there. Kind of like weave it through this a little bit in order to encourage it to grow up. And then once it starts, it'll take off.
Let me ask you a
I don't
question.
know if
We
we
have
need
wood, right?
Yeah.
We got to staple it.
Yeah, that would probably be the best way. You could zip tie it too. You could use zip ties, yeah. that would wear on the wood eventually with time. So like it sits it and breaking eventually, you know what I mean, when it gets heavy.
That's a good point. Yeah, probably the staple. You could probably just tie it to
But
stabilize
this
it.
is what you would
Yeah, this is nice because it has the whole thing. Yeah.
So is this side too high?
It should be okay because we can take a staple and just like bring it down to the ground.
Okay.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
No, not yet.
But in theory, you want it closer to the ground.
But that's the way
This
to
is,
use it.
it's actually, you have like enough slack that you can bring it down, so this is actually okay, like that, yeah. But you do want it so that the bottom, in some way you want to get it so that the bottom rung is like low enough.
Really need to go that part out and there aren't any plants.
If we can use the
Refit. That's what I was gonna ask too. This bed will be for things that will use this.
yeah,
Okay,
yeah, so
that's
we
the
can
other.
reseed with more
Right, it's not like pull
cucumbers
these
and
up,
stuff.
but we're gonna put, Alright.
Yeah, and actually the same thing with the zucchini, where you guys have some open space there, we can reseed with. I don't know, it looks like a tree leaf.
For a minute, I thought I saw 3 leaves on each thing.
It's not a poison ivy.
poison ivy.
It's not poison
It
ivy.
didn't look like,
It does look like a tree.
yeah.
A little tree. So Gregory does have another example of using kind of like the overhead trellising method outdoors, which is cool with the tomatoes. Yeah. So in this case, did you prune?
Inside, probably. Oh, the stick?
Yeah, so doing like that kind of method. So just kind of as an alternative method, you did all the pruning on these too, right?
Yeah.
Kind of the initial? Yeah. So for these tomatoes, these were ones that, I don't know if you want to talk about kind of how you set it up, what you did.
Well, I had to, that was my wood in there.
Use some scrap wood?
I made my trellis.
But,
Yeah.
good
Yeah.
teacher, go ahead.
No.
What you do, man?
Yeah.
You ain't gonna share, man?
Like,
So
did you
how-
nail it or staple it on the?
Yeah.
I use screws.
Oh, you use screws
to attach the horizontal thing for it, and I hammered it in the vertical into the ground.
Oh, okay.
And
See how sturdy.
I had some
Yeah, that's nice and sturdy.
section pieces that I used, and I have some more.
Nice and sturdy too.
Change that,
I do.
and then just let them lift their way up. But then I
Yep.
clipped off
Yeah.
on the
So
bottom
this would be like an example of an overhead.
Right.
Yeah.
because they were.
Yeah.
You did a
See,
good job. I'm
I
saying you did a
just,
good job.
I just wondered about this. This is what I was talking. I guess it doesn't make sense. But instead of it climbing up the twine or whatever you call it, what about as you get at the top part, tie it, and as it grows, you tie it up tighter, and you know what I mean, shorten the. Or you're saying the plant wouldn't be strong enough to hold that? You understand what I'm saying?
I don't think so.
Okay,
No.
for example, here, there's not one here.
Yeah.
And if this is the top,
Yeah.
you put the twine around here,
Yeah.
you tie it where it's kind of, and as it grows,
Yeah.
you shorten the rope, the rope.
Oh,
Yeah.
yeah. Okay.
Yeah, I can see how you can do that, but sometimes they'll get top heavy, and if they lay down, they'll start rooting.
Well, that's what I meant.
Well-
You monitor it, or they do it like overnight, get top heavy.
Yeah. I think what would happen if you just kind of kept shortening it and pulling it higher is you would kind of strip the plant as you're pulling it up.
So you would like strip off some of the leaves. So like when Gregory tied it down below, he's like only gonna tie it there once.
Okay.
And then now he'll just kind of
It'll
like
lay-
wrap it around
okay.
or like guide it out.
Yeah, and then I've been using a little piece of twine
Or that.
to
Yeah.
hook it to the other twine.
Yep.
Okay.
Yeah.
Cool.
So at some point you'll have to see. At some point you might need a metal post
Right.
as reinforcement.
Right.
At some point you'll have to see how big these guys get, but you might need a metal post kind of as a support. But
Or teepee, good.
a little teepee
Teepee
section.
thing is
But-
on
Okay.
those. Yeah.
But no, this is really cool too. So
Yeah, he did a good job.
yeah. Okay.
There's so much on the bottom. This right here.
About trellising or pruning.
What is that, what's that netting called? Is that like forest netting?
Yeah, so it goes by a bunch of different names. You could call it like trellis netting, or the brand name is Hortanova.
Or Nova?
Hortanova, like HORT, and then Nova, NOVA.
Okay.
Yeah. Yeah, any other questions about trellising, pruning? Anything like that? Okay, cool. So yeah, now is probably a good time. Many of you have your tomatoes in. Some of them could probably still use a little bit longer, maybe like another week or two before you install the trellising, but you can always put the posts in early and then just wait until they're kind of the right size to put in the line as well.
What would happen if you did do it too soon? Would it matter? Or they just wouldn't climb it the right way?
Yeah, for the cucumbers, it doesn't matter. Like you could install the cucumber trellising at the time of planting if you were just seeding them. For the tomatoes, if you install the line too soon, then the tomato plants like might not grow up like through it. They'll kind of still like fall off to the side. So you'll just have more work to do to bring them back into the fold.
Okay,
Yeah.
thank you.
Yep. Okay. So I wanted to talk a little bit also, just kind of briefly about fertility management. So we've talked, kind of focused a bit today on some of the summer fruiting crops. And all of those crops are examples of plants that are going to be in the ground for a pretty long time. Like the tomatoes, the cucumbers, those are pretty much throughout the entire summer you're going to be growing them, right? So for the next at least 2 to 3 months. And when you have crops in the ground that long, a lot of times they'll need some kind of like supplemental fertilizer at some point during the season in order to kind of give them the nutrients they need in order to produce fruit. It's pretty like, if we kind of talk about it in, like to use like a money analogy, it's pretty expensive to grow fruit, to produce fruit. Versus it's not as expensive to just produce a bunch of leaves, like with lettuce or something. So a lot of times that means they're kind of drawing down the savings from the soil or the nutrient bank, basically.
The fruit? Yeah, stuff that bears fruit.
Yeah, yeah. So anything that any of the fruiting crops, you usually want to start fertilizing when they start fruiting. So once you start to see something that's resembling a tomato or that's resembling a cucumber would be when you start to fertilize. And then depending on what kind of fertilizer you're using would determine how often you're doing it. Sometimes you can just put down one side dress. So you just put down like one kind of topping of fertilizer at the time of fruiting and then no more. That works really well in conventional agriculture systems where they're using a synthetic fertilizer where you can have really high levels of nitrogen and potassium and phosphorus. A lot of the kind of organic fertilizers like the fish guts we have in there, for example, have lower nutrient levels, so you usually have to do them a few times. So if we're talking about something like tomatoes in this system using the fertilizer, you'd want to fertilize at the time that they start to fruit,
and then you'd probably want to do it at like every couple weeks or so after that point until they're done fruiting, like in the end, until August or so.
What about worm poop tea?
Yeah, so you could use something, you know, there's a lot of different kinds of like things that you can add. Worm poop tea, for those of you who might not know, it's like a compost tea, basically. So it's taking some kind of compost and like making a tea out of it. Just like you would a tea that you would drink, except you don't boil the water. You just kind of, it's a cold tea. And then you're putting that extract, that tea, onto the plants. Something like a compost tea, usually what they're contributing to the soil is microbial activity. So like microorganisms and biological life to the soil to encourage more activity, which can provide then more nutrients to the plant. Something like a fish fertilizer, in contrast, is kind of directly providing something like the nitrogen and the potassium that a plant might need. So it's a little bit of a different approach in some ways, but both of them can be effective. I think if you're doing compost tea, though, a lot of times people will do them on like an almost every time they water, or like weekly or so.
Wow.
Throughout the season. So it's not as much kind of like a 2 or 3 time thing like a fish fertilizer or some other kind of fertilizer would be.
Question, since
Yeah.
it's that 17, 12 year, cicadas are part of the soil fertilization, aren't they?
The shells or the
I thought that what they do
process?
living
Yeah.
underground for 12, 17 years.
Yeah. So I think cicadas feed on root systems, right? And on root exudates, right? Yeah. So they are a part of that soil ecosystem, definitely. And they usually don't have like a really negative effect necessarily on trees. Maybe in part because of their very slow life cycle. But yeah, they would be a part of that kind of soil community. Yeah.
What about something like bird
Yeah, so like a lot of times you can kind of top dress with something, top dress would just mean like putting it on top of the soil, with something like worm castings, which would be like a compost. But generally when you're applying compost to the soil, it's not providing kind of a quick uptake of nutrients. It's not providing like an immediate source of nutrients. It would be like if I went to the grocery store and I got like all the ingredients to prepare a meal, versus me going to like Chipotle and getting a burrito. Like that process of preparing all those ingredients and cooking it takes more time. And it's kind of the same process when you're adding something like compost. It kind of takes time to make it available for the plants to be able to take it up. So in that case, usually if you're using a compost, you would, and you're using it with the intention of like providing nutrients for the plants, you would apply it to the soil before you plant. Yep. So that's what we did, like with some of the compost here. We applied it to the soil before planting. You can use compost as a mulch, so you can like kind of put it on the top, usually just so those nutrients aren't like available to the plant that like immediately for that year. Yeah.
Part of the encouragement then of microbial life that it speeds up that intake process.
Yeah. Yeah, exactly. Yeah, right. It would be, yeah, to use the cooking analogy, it would be like if I had an air fryer versus if I was having to make my own fire or something like that. So it kind of speeds up that process of growing, or of making the nutrients available for the plant. So again, when we're talking about kind of summer fertility for any of the fruiting crops, we start to fertilize at the time when they're fruiting. We have fish fertilizer in there to use. The plants aren't probably ready to be fertilized, so we won't do it today, but can do it in one of the upcoming classes once they start to be fertilizing. Out here at this scale, you know, there's different approaches. You can get a system where you're injecting the fertilizer directly into your irrigation system. So you just, you know, would kind of make up a bucket of the fertilizer and you'd have some kind of way to inject it into your drip system, and then every time you irrigate the plants, they're getting, you know, fertilizer, or one time when you irrigate the plants, they're getting fertilizer. On this kind of scale, and probably on like a, you know, scale where you're growing on less than a half an acre, a lot of times you can do this manually pretty quickly. You know, let's say we have like, what, 25 tomato plants in this row. You can go through with a watering can where you have a diluted fish fertilizer, and you just like apply about, you know, a cup's worth of that solution to each plant. So it would take you 2 watering cans to do this whole bed, if that, less than that probably. So that would be kind of a way to provide that on this kind of scale. So, whoa. Yeah. A couple things I wanted to talk about, in particular with fertility, to be aware of when we're talking about fruiting crops, is nitrogen and potassium. So those 2 nutrients, you know, those are in particular for tomatoes, cucumbers, again, anything that we're producing for the fruit. Nitrogen is very important for the plant, especially when it's in its earlier stages of growth. So for the first like 4 to 6 weeks, when mostly what it's doing is it's producing a lot of leaves. So nitrogen, think of nitrogen, is really important for leaf growth. Yeah. Yeah. Potassium, meanwhile, is usually a nutrient that you are wanting to add in at the time when the plant is fruiting. So it's really important for fruit development and for kind of getting good fruit development on the plant. So like a fish fertilizer is mostly nitrogen with a little bit of potassium and phosphorus. Yeah. Right. Oh, yeah, I think those are probably big enough. But that does bring up a good point, because yours have been in the ground for a couple of weeks now, right? 2 to 3 weeks or so. Yeah, yeah. So at this point, when you're starting to see flower growth, the plant has enough leaf. You know, it has kind of enough mass, enough leaf growth, that it's going to be able to support those fruits, and it's still going to keep growing. I think we got a few of the donated tomatoes that were transplanted that have the big, like if they have a tomato on it at the time of transplanting, or if they have flowers on it at the time of transplanting, you want to take those tomatoes or take those flowers off.
Okay.
Yeah, because what the plant is signaling at that point, if it's starting to produce a fruit when it's like this tall or this big, is it's saying, I'm stressed and I want my genes to pass on to the next generation. So I'm just gonna reproduce and be done. And so if you don't remove those flowers or that fruit, then it likely won't kind of encourage it to grow as much and produce more leaves. It's gonna be like, okay, I reproduced, I'm done, see ya. So you want to kind of prune off any of those flowers or fruit until it gets to probably be in the ground at least like two weeks or so. And then at that point you can let kind of any of the flowers that you see keep going. So this happens a lot. I mean, tomatoes are pretty resilient. You can plant them when they're pretty large and like look kind of stressed, and they'll usually bounce back just fine. But it is important to prune off those flowers and fruit. Yeah. Okay. Are there any questions on that? On fertility?
Are you gonna hurt the plant if you prune the buds again? Like I pruned them before I planted them, and then I pruned them after I planted them because they were still kind of short.
Yeah. So like you prune the flowers off within like a couple weeks of planting them or something? No, not at all.
Okay,
Yeah. So what'll happen? You know, if you saw on the stem that we were looking at in there, it's a pretty long stem and it had multiple flower clusters on it. So when you prune off one of the flower clusters, just says, okay, nope, not this time. And then once it gets bigger, it'll produce another flower cluster on that stem. So you lost kind of, you know, maybe that initial set, but it probably was good in that case if it was trying to fruit in the first couple weeks.
Okay.
Yeah. It was good that you removed it. So, yeah. Okay. Cool. I wanted to look at a couple other things in the field and kind of just do a bit of a field walk. And we can talk through some of the things that people have mentioned. Take off this bell.
Irrigation.
Yeah. Yes. Yeah. Yep. That's on the list. Yeah.
So,
Okay.
with this pest,
Yeah.
well,
No, go ahead.
with this pest issue, I know you had mentioned, I mentioned something about garlic. What about when we put this back together?
Yeah.
like this?
When it does this, what's going to happen kind of the next year or the next season? Yeah, you'll get about like 1,000 more of these that'll start to come up. So that's called like your weed seed bank. So kind of the bank of weed seeds that you have in your field. And our goal kind of over time is to reduce the number of weeds that are in the field. And so we would do that in part by reducing the number of seeds that are hanging out in the beds. So like for something like this isn't it's really not like too big of a deal right now. We have a couple options. One, if it's going to be planted relatively soon, you know, you could just wait, or you could go through and till it once. So going through and tilling would probably, you know, kill most of these weeds. You'd want to wait until it's drier because it's much too wet to till right now. But probably by like Sunday or something, assuming we don't get another huge downpour, I'm guessing it would probably be dry enough. So if you were planning to plant it, you know, within the next couple weeks, you could do something like that. You would till it once and then maybe till it again right before you plant, depending on kind of how it's looking. If you are waiting a little bit longer before you planted, then the other strategy that you could use is you could take one of those tarps and put it over it. Yep. Yeah, because you'll notice with like all of our tarp beds over there, that like as you see some of the plastic coming off, like they're pretty clean, right? So that's kind of a strategy that'll kill all of these weeds here. It might also encourage other weeds to germinate, and then we'll also kill them. Because the tarp is kind of providing, again, that nice, warm, moist environment for the soil, and which encourages weed seeds to grow, encourages any seeds to grow. And then it blocks out light, so it kills them. Yep.
Will the fabric do the same thing?
Yeah, so you could use the fabric as well. The fabric will take a little bit longer because it lets air in. So the tarp also kind of functions as like a way to like almost suffocate the weeds in some sense. So the landscape fabric will do the same thing if you just put down a row of landscape fabric. But I would probably wait a couple weeks after doing that before planting.
So if you go through with a tiller, do you have to like worry about the cloth or anything, things next to it? Like,
yeah, if you went through with the tiller, it's a pretty narrow space, right? Yeah. So you would have to make sure, you know, that you're not getting this.
It's snatching.
And you would definitely want to make sure to move the row cover out of the way.
You never mentioned about fire.
About flame weeding?
Flame weeding.
Yeah. So
or something like this.
That could be another approach for something like this. Yeah, these are actually probably at right about the right size. You'd have to have the flame weeder to do that.
Right.
You could get like a propane torch and like do it kind of by hand, but it would be pretty tedious. I'd say, you know, I'm a little bit lazy, I guess, in that sense, because I would just like put down a tarp and wait a couple weeks. So it kind of depends on what you're planting, though. You know, if the goal is to plant this bed within the next week or so, then I would take the tillage approach and till, and then wait a couple days, because just by tilling, you're probably going to have a lot of these grasses and everything kind of on the surface. So you want to wait a couple days to dry everything out and make sure it's killed, and then come through either with the hoe or with the tiller again, and just kind of make sure it's really clean. So again, like this is not a problem if you intend to kind of turn it over relatively quickly, but we just really want to make sure, you know,
you guys probably have noticed how quickly, you know, everything is just like growing like crazy at this time of year. So it's not probably going to take very long for it to get to this stage where you're going to start to be dealing with weed seed. So it's a good idea to kind of manage it when it's at this stage in some way. Okay. And then this is a great example. This is the bed that you weeded, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. So this is a great example of the onion beds that Vinay just weeded today. So with any of the plastic, you know, again, like the main kind of benefit of using this plastic is that it reduces the amount of space that you have to weed. So with the, you know, with the tomatoes, with this, what else are we growing in these? Like, I guess we'll be growing leeks, maybe, and some other things. You know, it really cuts down on the amount of time that you're weeding. But you do need to go through, usually when they're in a pretty young stage, and, you know, kind of pull out any weeds that are coming up out of the holes. So, like, this is an example, you know, of something that, trying to think of what, your bed probably looked like maybe it had a few more weeds like over there, right? So it had like a lot more grasses that really had just popped up in the last like week or two. With all the rain and with the warm weather, they'll grow really quickly. So doing kind of an early weeding when these plants are pretty small still is a good idea. And then you'll probably only have to do one more at some point in like 2 to 3 weeks, kind of later on in the season. So just kind of a reminder with the plastic, it cuts down on your weeding, but you usually still have to plan for probably 2 weedings with it. Okay, we also do have leeks in there, by the way, for the farmers who are here. The leeks are here, so if you want to plant leeks, they're inside in a tray. I think everyone had a bed of leeks, so you're welcome to plant them just kind of the same way in the plastic. Okay. So, yeah. Or if you're plastic, if you have some empty holes, you could just fill it in with leeks instead. Oh. That's also fine. Yeah. Yeah.
Oh, so if I wanted to do that with my prepped onion bed,
yeah.
could I just do something else on the last bed?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. Yeah. If you wanted to. Yeah. Okay.
Some beets and let's see.
I mentioned with the tomatoes, let's see, I mentioned about the tomatoes, some of the tomatoes that are transplanted, like Jamila, I can see some of the tomatoes on those guys over there, on some of the tomato plants that you transplanted. You'll just want to pop off those tomato plants to encourage them to grow, yeah. And then any place where we direct seeded, so like the cucumbers and zucchini, if you've seeded those and they're starting to come up and you're noticing that there's holes where nothing is growing, it could be for a number of reasons. I think in some cases we were kind of using some older seed. In other cases, you know, you can get like rodent or rodent damage from them. So, you know, it could be for a variety of reasons, but it's a good idea at this stage to go back through when the plants are relatively young and just put in new seeds wherever you have holes. So plan to do that, you know, kind of within, again, also about like the next week or so. If you do it after the other plants have gotten really big, then what can happen is one, they'll like start to shade out the other spaces in the bed, but then two, those plants, like baby plants and full-size plants, require different amounts of water. So if you have a bunch of baby plants in the bed, but then also your like mature plants which are producing fruit, you're probably going to be flooding your baby plants because your mature plants need so much more water. Yeah. The other thing, so I know we're kind of in a bit of a balancing act right now while we still have some groundhog pressure, but we don't have the fence up with some of our cool season crops and covering them. So at this point, I would say generally recommend that we, you know, you could, if you're noticing that you have groundhog damage on some of your plants, you could try covering them again for the next couple weeks. But if you can get away with it, then don't cover them, because what's going to happen for all of the like spring crops, so any of the like kind of crops that prefer the colder season, when they have that row cover under there, have you guys like stuck your hand under there on a warm day, on a sunny day? It's hot. It's like, it doesn't allow any air movement in there, and it traps the heat like a blanket. So it takes longer to heat up, but then once it does heat up, it stays warmer. So it can be kind of the environment that a lot of those like cool season crops don't like as much. So as soon as we get our fence up, then it'll probably be a good idea to remove that row cover so that they're kind of in a cooler environment.
You're putting a fence around this whole thing?
Yeah.
Schedule date for the fence.
2 weeks.
Wow.
Yeah. We gotta, yeah.
That's a big job.
Yeah. It's gonna be a low fence, so we'll be like pounding in T-posts actually pretty similar to here. And just putting them in about every like 8 feet or so, and then putting up chicken wire with it. So it came recommended from an exterminator as the way to keep groundhogs out. Yeah, the like C-shaped kind of, yep. So it'll have, it'll have kind of like this apron along the bottom. So it'll have a section that's like right along the ground and then come up, so the groundhog can't burrow underneath. And then it'll have a little like top on it. We'll bend a top on it so it can't climb over either. So fingers crossed.
Can step over it?
But yeah, so we can create like a gate in one section that we just go through. Or we hurdle, one of the two. Okay, one last thing before we talk about the irrigation system. I wanted to point out one weed that can be a problem. I'm trying to figure out where I saw it. Bindweed. Have you guys dealt with bindweed before? Anyone experienced that? Okay. Let me find it. I think I saw it in some of these beds.
It's the like light pink flowers?
I haven't seen it flowering yet. Was it flowering? Hold on. Give me 1 second and I'll find it. Weeks ago, when we talked about weed management, because I didn't really see any out here, it's a perennial. It's called bindweed. You can pass it around if you want.
Looks like a pea plant.
Yeah.
Oh, this stuff.
It's like a little kind of like, almost like a shovel-shaped leaf.
Like mint.
Here. Yeah, it's not, well, in some ways it is like mint in that it'll take over an area pretty quickly. So,
Little white flowers on it?
yeah.
Little morning glory
Yeah,
flowers?
white or pink or purple.
Yeah.
Yeah.
What did you say it was called again? I'm sorry.
Bindweed. Bindweed. Like, yeah. Probably the reason that it's called that is because it'll kind of choke out everything and bind up any plant that it comes across. It also will trellis up plants, so it can be something that can be quite a bit of a pain. Similar to like we talked about some of the grasses or like thistle, which is a perennial, so it's hard to dig up the root system, the full root system of it, because it has kind of a trailing root that will spread out across the soil. So the best practice for something like this is, again, just to kind of get rid of it while it's relatively small. You're kind of starving the root system then of energy, and kind of play a little bit of like the long game, and that by doing it over the course of the season, going into the winter, it's not going to have enough energy to survive the winter. So you kind of do that for a year or two, and then you can rid yourself of bindweed a bit. So that can be a good way to manage it. But it does, it will climb up things. It'll kind of snake itself around things. So getting it while it's relatively young is important.
Yeah, I got a big problem.
Yeah. It'll take over pretty quick. I think that's pretty much it. I wanted to go talk through just showing the irrigation timer to the farmers who have a plot here, so we can talk about how to use it and everything. But otherwise, that's, I think, pretty much it for the night at this point, 7:30. Are there any other questions or comments?
For
So I think we do have like a bindweed in a sense with our squash, like
Yes.
we're trying to get it
That's
out.
where I saw it. Yeah,
Okay.
yeah. Yep.
So it's underneath. So
Yeah.
just keep.
There's your buddy over there.
Oh, there he is.
One of many.
Is it?
Look, there's two over there.
Yeah, that's what I saw.
Yeah.
They just came out to say hi and
They're
thank you.
surrounding us.
Hi and thank you.
Not afraid.
Okay, well, soon enough you'll all be gone.
Yeah.
You'll all be excluded.
Life always finds a way.
Yeah, in the gopher patch we provided off to the side.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
All right. We'll leave that
Yeah.
policy.
Okay, so I think then that's about it for this week. So we don't have class next week. Next week is just kind of a work day out here. We have class in 2 weeks, and we're going to be talking about pests and diseases again. Oh yeah.
I'm sorry, did you say we don't have classes?
No class next week. We'll have class in 2 weeks.